Hello, everyone. I wanted to invite you to join the Creative Social Impact Collective. It is a community of creative-minded change makers like you that are working together to deepen their impact in the work they're doing. And as a thank you, you get a free download of the 5 steps to reimagining or imagining a new program, project, venture, or movement to bring the change that we want to see into the world today. Hope to see you there. And I think we use a lot of words, and I don't think people really understand. So I'm gonna call it out: racism. A lot of people use the word racism, and there were some things that you talked about. We've heard of, and you mentioned today about structural racism. We've heard about systemic racism, but there were some others that you talked about and gave some really cool examples about, like, this is what it looks like when this is happening. Can you share a little bit about the different types and maybe give some examples so our audience can wrap their brains around what we're talking about?
Racism is one of those mechanisms that's really, really complex. Sometimes, because we grew up in society, we just kind of take for granted certain terms, but we don't actually fully know what they mean. And you hit the nail on the head. Structural racism, systemic racism, it gets thrown around so much today in the media. People don't really define it. And I think that's unfortunate, but the way I like to define it, at least for my students in Intro to Sociology last semester, was I wanted them to think of racism as a complex system that, of course, uses this ranking system of, race and, white supremacy, of course, and then the other, to kind of allocate specific resources and goods. One example, if we want to take it back, because the origins of racism, they run pretty deep in this country. We can go back to, let's say, the Jim Crow era. Folks were trying to get decent housing, but they were unable to move into certain neighborhoods, because of redlining, and perhaps they weren't able to get homeowners insurance or, loans from the bank. And based on their skin color. Folks will call that probably institutional racism if we're going to talk about the types, right? But I always wanted my students to know that it doesn't just stop there as far as explaining what racism is, because you also have obviously discrimination on an interpersonal level. And if you can understand discrimination, which essentially means unfair treatment based on someone's social status, then you can understand how institutions and people who work in those institutions can discriminate interpersonally and through the institution. So now we have 2 different types of racism. And then I think one of the most important forms of racism is cultural racism, because that really undergirds both of those types of racism. Essentially, those are the beliefs, right? The prejudice, the attitudes that pretty much spurred and started, what we have now. It all started with these ideas that certain groups are inferior because of their skin color and their culture. So I think that those 3 together are really, really important: cultural racism, institutional racism, through hiring practices and things of that nature, but then also interpersonal racism. And I think interpersonal racism is the one that gets talked about the most. But in order for us to think about this in a structural way, we have to include all forms of racism. Now, there are other forms. Gendered racism, that's kind of an example of how you as a Black woman, you're going to have different types of racism thrown at you because you're a Black woman. Whereas me as a Black man, I'm seen, a little differently. They're going to throw racism at me in a certain way. Of course, environmental racism. But I think the 3 main types that people should focus on is interpersonal, institutional, and cultural racism. And that'll help you understand structural racism as a whole.
I think that the structural piece to it and how because the construct is what we're looking at, right? And if you go back to the incept of redlining and how that really when people talk about the division of the country, the dividing of things, right? Redlining was huge, because here we are Reconstruction era. Well, people starting to do things and people starting to migrate from space to space. And they're like, well, since we're free by the letter of the law, I can go and be and this and that and the third. But someone's like, well, we want that land too. So wait a minute, we already did the divide and conquer thing. There's no more manifest destiny because we all here. That's what they said. But then you're only subjugated to live there. And then what ends up happening, all of the policies that are written to actually bring funding and all this stuff off into one direction is not actually being, proportionally reasoned out and rationed out. So the fact that you have that layer is so much superficial to a lot of people. And it's like, the other side of the tracks mentality, they think it's superficial, but it actually, like you said, it is being held up by all the other different things, because what's on top of that is because you live there. Now I can look at you and judge you and have this interpersonal feeling about you because you live over in that space. And then I'll look at, oh, and that's the skin color that goes along with it. So that's a huge thing, what you just said right there.
Yeah, and I think that, just to kind of build on that, that point is so important. Um, I mean, even just people simply not wanting to be in the same spaces as Black folks, right? You mentioned Reconstruction. I mean, you just freed all these slaves, or excuse me, enslaved people for centuries. White folks didn't have to dwell with us, particularly in the South. But now all of a sudden, y'all want them to move into our neighborhoods, and this lasted for decades. I mean, we know about white flight, and how inner cities became what they became. I mean, even something as simple as Black folks trying to get in the same swimming pool,
Right.
as white people. That's really at the core, of racism, which is why I think cultural racism is so important. Again, like your belief system. If you believe that this particular group is, inferior to you and disgusting and dangerous, et cetera, that's going to drive how you treat them,
Right.
and subsequently how they're viewed by society as a whole.
All right, we just gonna call it out.
Please.
You're Black. Miles, I see you.
Yeah.
And you're a sociologist. I want to know, other than the fact that you Black and you're a sociologist, what made you decide you wanted to research racism?
I always just bring it back to the social determinants of health. They're so big, and racism is a social determinant of health. What I mean by social determinant of health, around the time of like 1899, when Du Bois was, he was the first Black PhD from Harvard and all this stuff. He was going to do this really, really great study on Black folks in Philadelphia. Now, this is around the time when science is kind of, advancing a little bit. But what he noticed was that the health disparities between Black folks and white folks in Philadelphia weren't really rooted in biological stuff. It was rooted in their social conditions, right? Where they lived, where they worked, and how awful those conditions were, right? The types of jobs that they had to have, that would exhaust them, and then essentially the wages that they had that wouldn't really allow them to get the resources that they needed to be healthy and well, over the life course. Those are social determinants of health, and racism is a big social determinant of health. Again, going back to my first definition about how they use that ranking system, to decide who gets what. And now it's a lot more, covert or, subtle, right? But there are still ways in which, we're perhaps denied certain resources that could be beneficial to us, even just our communities, right? The schools, the housing that people have. I mean, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but these really are the most fundamental things as far as allowing someone to have, opportunity to be as healthy as they can be every single day.